Hey. Yes, that was a nice introduction. Can you see the image, the magnificent image? Yes. So, a bit of background. I work for Tyne Wear Archives Museums, which is in the northeast of England. We have 9 museums and galleries, 1 archives. My office is in Newcastle. Has anyone ever been to Newcastle? Yeah. It's very much like Gothenburg. I was walking around last night thinking, the industrial landscape, which is soon to disappear, magnificent city. Anyway, so we are in the northeast of England. We have all of these museums and galleries with pretty much every collection type within them, art, archaeology, history, and so on. 1.1 million objects, and we have 12 miles of archive shelf, which I thought was a lot, but I was speaking to a guy last night who has 130 kilometers of shelf. I felt inadequate. And we're still in the process of kind of publishing collections online, but we have nearly half of the museum collections online. Barely any of the archives collections are digitized and online. My role is digital programs manager. We have a digital team, a small digital team, that are very different from the documentation team, that are very different from the web development team. That work still happens, but our team is much more about public engagement projects where there is an attempt to look at how digital projects can improve access and innovate engagement with collections. So this talk will provide an overview of some of the work that we are doing within our program, but particularly it's going to focus on our approach to digital creative reuse of collections and our attempts to encourage and to work with different types of partner outside of the organization to work with us. I will start at the very start, so just to give a bit of context, the principles that got us into the place where we are now, along the way I'll talk about the learning that this project has, how it's been valuable to the museum, the principles that this project has informed, and we say digital R&D. This is much less about digital R&D in terms of an R&D of an application of a technology. For me, it's much more of an R&D into what the collections are for, and that's a pretty big fundamental question that, for me, is at the heart of the work that we do. It is digital work, but I feel within the digital work there are some very fundamental questions that we're probing at and annoying curatorial staff with, and so on. So it's a live study, in my own opinion, of essentially what the collections are for. This is obviously a principle that has been long talked about within the museum world, and the idea of making collections freely available, with the idea of just speculatively seeing what happens when the public gain access to collections and what they'll do with them. So for a number of years, we've adopted this principle. This is a quote that I've referred to again and again from a really interesting report from March 2010, where cultural organizations are over-optimistic about the perceived commercial value of our collections and not excited enough about present public value. This is as relevant today as it always has been, but back in 2010, 2011, this was something that I sort of spoke to senior managers about and to directors and partner organizations, just to try and push the idea that we should be releasing collections rather than attempting to understand their commercial value and prohibiting use because we feel there's money in them, which there's not. Flickr Commons 2011, again, this is a fairly successful and established project. We participated with this 4 years ago. For the organizations, I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with this project, but it's very much about providing open access to cultural institutions' photography. No copyright restrictions can be placed on content that exists within the site. There is a huge audience, which is obviously the main reason why people would want to publish collections on there. And it's been a really successful project for us. Apart from just gaining a large audience, it's been a piece of action research for TWAM to help understand how an audience would want to talk about, would want to reuse, would want to republish our collections. So we've got a very modest number of images within there. This is not there is no dedicated member of staff engaging with this project. We just sort of publish as and when. There's only 74 sets of images, over 1,500 images in total. We get over 13 million views. Sorry, we've had over 30 million views in under 4 years. The daily average is about 20,000. You know, it's a big number. You don't really know what it means. But we have lots of rich engagement within that, so lots of comments, lots of favorites. And, you know, it's such a low-maintenance project, but it does a lot for us in terms of opening our collections up to new audiences. As an example of how it's sort of caught the imagination of our audiences. We seem to do very well when we publish police mugshots. Is mugshots the word you'd use here? Police ID shots. Yeah. Whenever we publish these, they go in the national press, and they go around the internet, and BuzzFeed picks them up, and we get phone calls. And anyway, we published a set of 1930s criminal mugshots, and this is one particularly interesting guy. And we published them online. We didn't really have much information about them. I actually stumbled across the ID book in the archives when looking for something else entirely. But then we published it online. Millions of people used them, and it went into there was an ongoing BBC report on the stories behind these people. And somebody in Australia did the research to understand how this man died. You know, you can see dead scrawled on that image in very thick, deliberately thick handwriting from the policeman, who you guess was quite pleased that he maybe passed away. So these are known criminals. Anyway, there was such rich engagement. People adopted them as their own research projects, and somebody in Australia managed to understand exactly what happened to this guy. So, you know, all we did was facilitate the access to the collections, and all the rich engagement followed without us having to facilitate. For me, the interesting learning comes when people talk about our collections in different ways, in ways that we ordinarily wouldn't. So again, this is maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This is another police ID shot. We do have more collections than just criminals. These are maybe the terms that ordinarily the museum would use to categorize the collection. So it's social history. It's actually Edwardian Britain. I got that wrong. And it's seemingly an Italian immigrant. There are themes within that the museum would relate to, and I've sort of flagged them up. But in terms of how the public reused this image, it told us much more about what this image, the value of this image for them. So clearly themes of crime and punishment, so it's dropped in social media folders which relate to those broad themes. People are really interested in the handwriting on the chalkboard, so a style of handwriting that doesn't exist anymore. This is somebody's blog. People used it as a provocation on social justice and prison reforms, to talk very seriously about contemporary prison issues, comparing and contrasting them to photography from the past. And this is the biggest referrer of traffic from the site. If you publish attractive men online, you will get reuse. This is frivolous, but who's to say it's right? Who's to say it's wrong? I think it's fantastic myself. But essentially these are all qualities that the public imbued from the images, not necessarily qualities that we would write in the object record. So the 2 key lessons from this project back in 2011-2012 were that there can be a disparity between the historical themes the museums do talk about with their collections and the historical themes audiences are interested in. And that museums can inspire new public engagement with collections when we enable new and imaginative articulations of their value. That's a long sentence, sorry. But it's very much about, if we give the proper access to audiences, they will reimagine it in a way that will open it up to a brand new audience for the museum. So this principle of historical themes that the public are interested in, for me it feels like a battle in that there is a general fatigue, I think, for some audiences about what history means to them, and Northeast England, there are fairly the themes the historical themes connecting to the northeast of England are industry and the bridges and there's a river and of coal mining, and these are all really important historical themes. But for anyone who's not interested in those themes, when we continually wheel out those themes again and again and again, it just sort of plays to their sense of fatigue. And there's nothing in there that disrupts what I see as a perception of the past, which I feel is quite important. So we developed an app in 2012, with Newcastle Libraries, and this was about the stories relating to the city of Newcastle that didn't conform to any of the themes that I've spoken about. They were much more about the niche stories, and we launched a version of it in 2012, and then a company called Anyone, who's I don't know how to describe them. They're a kind of a commercial entity, but their reason for existing is to drive footfall in the city centre. They gave us a load of money to do another version of it because they wanted to see traffic in the city centre. They wanted to see people walking about and looking up and buying pizza and asking questions about the city. So it explores the strange and forgotten histories of Newcastle. Within it are 75 stories which relate to the people, events, and the moments. And bound up within all of this is collections. This is a collections project, but the collections are represented as stories and as illustrations for the stories. And for anyone who uses the app, if you're wandering around the city centre, you get an alert, which might be annoying for you, but we're trying to cause people to kind of question places that they thought they knew. So one example story might be John Wilson, who was employed by the council to pull bodies from the river. That was his job, and that was in the 1700s. And he was paid per corpse. And this is a man called William Martin, who's probably one of my favorite characters in Newcastle's history. And he was an inventor and he was a scientist, but he was maybe mostly famous for just being a bitter man full of hatred, who felt that every other scientist or every other contemporary stole his ideas. And he published his own works. They're online. Google Books have digitized a lot of his works. Really bad poetry about why he's right and the world is wrong. And it's just astonishing. His story is placed on the High Level Bridge, which is a stunning bridge across the river. It was not invented by William Martin, but the story is that William Martin said it was. So that's where his story is. And we have lots of intriguing images like this. Persons desirous of having their shins broken are respectfully requested to go to the Castle Leazes. We had no idea what this meant. This is an advert from a newspaper in the 1800s, inviting people to have their shins broken. We think it is quite a quirky attempt to advertise a shinty match. I don't know if shinty is a sport that you're familiar with. It's psychotic. It's crazy. You hurl a ball around really hard and really fast, and it's still played in the Highlands of Scotland, and you do get injured. And I think that's what it was. Anyway, the whole point was that the historical themes were informed by user interest that we'd picked up on from reuse projects such as Flickr Commons. So we wanted to focus on startling events rather than grand achievements. Rather than this big worldwide invention was located in this, happened within this building. It was much more about the unknown. Forgotten lives, we didn't want to talk about celebrated people. Strangeness and eccentricity was embraced. And failure was a theme that people were very interested in when we published content online, such as William Martin, rather than the big successes. Rather than telling the history of Newcastle through its successes, we wanted to talk about it through its failures. When we worked with Anyone, this company, though, they kind of liked it, but they said, can we have fewer murders? Can we have some of the big histories, the celebrations? And we had to kind of compromise a little. So it's maybe not as overwhelmingly bleak as it was. But the aim was to create compelling collections experiences outside the museums with stories and not objects. The objects were in there, they just weren't the defined experience in themselves. So we didn't want to teach histories necessarily. We didn't want people to leave knowing who William Martin was, but what we wanted to use that was as a vehicle to stir public imagination and to create sparks of empathy for the past, which it sounds quite intangible and difficult to measure. But what we wanted to do was for the people who maybe had that sense of fatigue regarding the history of the city of Newcastle, we wanted them to rethink what they thought they knew about the past and to invite questioning into places that they believed they were familiar with. So this is a quote that an idea that I love, and that the temptation, obviously, from the museum sometimes is to kind of give all of the information away, and is to give the chronology from the very, very start to the absolute end, and you kind of hope people are going to read all of it. Well, actually, we wanted just to provide glimpses, and we wanted to provide snapshots of something that would create sparks, and then it was entirely up to the audience if they wanted to pursue those sparks further. The app has to date received about over 13,000 downloads. Sorry. And the average dwell time is 8 minutes, which is huge, and I don't know how many of you look into your analytics, but usually our collections engagement on the website is about a minute, and so this is much more engaged. Audiences are much more engaged in this sort of experience. It's a very different type of experience. That's kind of a false comparison, really, but there's lots of rich engagement happening. And just to kind of extend this idea of how we encourage the public to really disrupt perceptions of the past, we worked with an internet radio station called Basic FM in 2013. And we put out an open call to the public for anyone who works with sound and music, and as an amateur, as a professional. We invited them to submit programs of content that played around with themes of the past, and we wanted to rearrange and create new meaning from the past. It's not very defined, but we wanted people to give us things that would provoke. So we had a 35-hour broadcast that was filled with amazing, crazy stuff. Imagined soundtracks to the construction of the bridges, reuse of oral histories with electronic music, field recordings, found sounds, performances. It was just this rich sort of tapestry of sounds that related to histories that we don't generally talk about. And 8,000 listeners from 26 countries tuned in for an average of 14 minutes. So I've touched a little bit on this already, but the learning from Flickr Commons was that when we open up collections to the public, they will create new articulations of its value, of its meaning, and we have pursued that over the last couple of years. And we have really, at the core of a lot of our work, it's been about enabling public experimentation with collections. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those projects that we've developed. So Half Memory was a project we developed in 2013 with a music company called Tusk Music and an arts program called Pixel Palace. And that invited filmmakers, musicians, and sound artists and other creative technologists to work with us and to identify resonant collections that they can use within their work, and then they would create work, and what we'd hope is that it would inspire audiences to ask questions of the collections. So we wanted, it was less about producing a kind of an end point, it was less about producing a piece of multimedia and that being the end of the project. For me, it was very much about the idea of what do we need to do here? We actually need to change public perceptions and attitudes to what the museum is for. So we wanted to promote the museum and the collections as a starting point for ideas and discussion, and as a starting point for creativity. So we wanted to engage audiences who already had the motivation and passion to create, who would be prepared to work with us either remotely or to come into our buildings and really brutally deconstruct the collections and objects that we have, and just to play around with the meanings that we have, how they would use the collections to connect with their own ideas and their own practice. And we did want to create ambitious work, for them to create ambitious work that at the end of it had an audience. And I've mentioned this already, but it was much less about them reinterpreting an object to teach its context, to talk about its history. It was much more about creating sparks, inspiring wonder, and stirring imagination. And we hoped that the work that was produced would compel a new public exploration of collections. And lastly, we hope that the work would showcase the idea that we as the museum are open to this kind of collaboration, and we wanted people to come to us with their own proposals, with their own ideas, with their own questions. So a number of projects were developed, and this is a man who produced, it ended up just being an album of music, but he worked with a scrapbook. One of the images from the scrapbook is this. And he basically lived in the archives for a few weeks, and he produced an album of music which explored a range of different themes, very non-traditional take on collections, but he really engaged deeply with the artifacts within the archives. This is a poem about 3 men killing a horse, and it's part of the scrapbook. It's about a horse who's come to the end of its working life, and it's how you put it to. I'm trying to think of a euphemism or some sort of way of it sounding respectful. But basically, three guys killing a horse. And if you go on YouTube and you type in "poor old horse," you will see this big, gruff man performing this work in front of hundreds of people, again and again and again and again. Thousands of people have engaged with this story through this man's performance, and it's quite full on. We worked with some filmmakers and some digital artists and musicians called Warm Digits, and they were taken with the images which documented the construction of Metro, which is the light rail network in the northeast of England, and they produced a film and an album of music, which, in their own words, was not about the construction of Metro. It was something much more than that. They wanted to use the music, the rhythm and repetition, to evoke an entrance and to encourage the audience to think about the position of hope in civic life 40 years and a lifetime from the origins of the photograph, which for me is massively ambitious. I loved this. They didn't want to tell the story of Metro. That would have been really boring. They wanted to use the source material to provoke in audiences questions about the idea of hope and civic life. It's kind of difficult to measure, but but it was ambitious. So throughout all of this project, the idea was that the voice of the museum would be silenced and subjective interpretation would replace the objective historic interpretation that we're accustomed to. Again, it was not about using objects as the experience endpoint. It was about them informing the work. This work was about animating concepts, ideas, stories, and questions. And it's through that the impact would be created. This kind of work is ongoing, and we're always really interested in how audiences use the collections, search the collections online, and we try and learn from how people might want to trawl through the collections and the frustrations that they might have in doing that. So, for some of our audiences, they're really just interested in finding the one unique, remarkable, beautiful buried story. That's all they want. They just want to find the one thing that has been untold within the museum, and it's like needle in the haystack. But that's what they want to do. There are people who really just want to work with collections on an aesthetic level, and they want the aesthetics to work with their own practice. So the filmmakers that I've just mentioned, they came into the museum and they said, "What collections do you have relating to post-war technological modernism and European urbanism?" And we were like, "I have no idea." So it was anyway. I'll talk about this in a second, but they wanted really just to be able to search on an aesthetic level, which is not the way that museums generally operate. People want to work with really just one detail of an object's artifact, of an object's record. They're much less interested in telling the full story of the object. And this is the thing where it's about the public who want to work with the collections, but they also want to have creative license, and they want to play around with the poetic gaps in an object's narrative. So they use the collections as a kind of a jumping off point for their own ideas. And they maybe come back to the collections, but they've reimagined something in between. So what we find is generally that audiences who work with us, and this includes audiences who we never meet but just sort of exist online and search the collections online, they can be quite frustrated by the way an online catalog works, or maybe just the way our online catalog works, and it does sometimes deter people from wanting to use the collections because it's so difficult to find information. And audiences want to search visually. I think this is kind of a known thing within the museums, is that for some people, they don't know what they want to find. They just want to be provoked, and they want sort of cues to help stimulate their research. So we're developing, maybe I won't talk about it actually. We're developing a project with Microsoft Research and Newcastle University, which is about the development of a visual interface that will allow audiences to easily stumble across information from their collections. And it will basically respond to how quickly you scroll through materials. So there will be an infinite scroll of really big images. And if you scroll really fast, you'll get contextually different information. because it's assuming that you haven't found anything that you're interested in. If you're scrolling slowly and you're clicking things and you're finding that this sort of material is of interest to you, you will be presented with contextually connected information. So it's going to hopefully look like the simplest thing in the world, but sitting underneath it will be all these difficult automations and intelligences. I can actually share information about that, but it's just not live. Maybe I can soon. Of this project, the impact was that we had 50,000 people who accessed the work online. There was a very high depth of public engagement. 150,000 views of collections following the publication of the work. So for everything that's produced, we also published the collections that informed that work. And there's so much interest in the kind of raw materials, as we call them. And lots of non-museum audiences have engaged with this project. And it was shortlisted for a Innovation Award at the Museum and Heritage Awards last year. And this is a particularly interesting comment. In a review of Richard's work, it was penetrating the heart of the archives, hidden stories. Richard Dawson draws out hidden truths in strong, bold strokes. And that's perfect. That's what we wanted to achieve with this project. 491 hours were contributed to the project from the public for free, just because they were interested. 24 subsequent proposals have come to the museum. People who just want to talk about the material that we have and how maybe we can support their collaboration, how we can collaborate with them and how we can support their work. Lots of other projects have just happened independently, which is the way it should be. People get access to the materials, they go away and produce something. A theatre production reused loads of our collections and toured up and down the country, and I didn't know about it for a year. And that was fantastic, just to kind of know that they took it upon themselves. They didn't need to talk to the museum about this. Perfect. So the kinds of proposals that come to us, one is being developed right now. Somebody's really interested in the idea of 3D printing, but thinks it's a bit boring, so he thinks, well, how can you 3D print something that would actually give an object new aura? Rather than lose the aura of the original, how can you give it new aura? So we're working on a drawing machine that's going to continually sketch versions of the collection and mash up different versions of the collection, and it's going to do it on a very large scale in the museum, so it'll look like a bit of a spectacle. It's going to be quite risky. It might break. There's participatory art project has been set up and has been funded to explore the family of in Gateshead called the Spence Watson, who are a big philanthropist family, and their story is generally unknown within Gateshead, which has quite a deprived area. And these are projects that have, this is not a commission. We don't give people money to make projects. They go and find the money themselves, and we work with them to find the money. We recently launched a project called Decoded, which was to tie in with the World War I commemorations. We deliberately wanted to do something different than just the usual solemn remembrance, so we put out an open call to the public to create new digital installations and events that invited new reflections on the untold stories of World War I in the Northeast. So there were large-scale video installations in public spaces of recreated regimental photography. That image on the left, which just looks like a carpet, is actually men, and it was filmed using participants who came into some workshops, and then they were kind of digitally tweaked and recreated tens of thousands of times, so it looks like a regimental photograph, but at scale it just looks like dots. And these were deliberately in public spaces where it was designed to provoke intrigue. There were live maker workshops in the museum where we would take the collections from relating to World War I sound recording technologies. We'd take collections relating to things like Morse code and hydrophones, and we'd try and rebuild them using contemporary tools. And we'd do it really out in the open with wires exposed, and it wasn't about creating a finished artifact. It was about a live experience within the museum, and we wanted people to come to us and stumble across it and ask questions about what the hell it was we were doing, because it looked crazy, but it was very interesting. This is a quote that I think is really important, and it really links to the work that we develop, in that the value of digital. This is from Seb Chan, who's at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, who's a really interesting thinker, and he does a lot of great work. For Seb, the value of digital in the museum is not about endless collections web development. It's about developing new forms of curatorial practice. Obviously, the collections web development is important as well, but digital. What we really mean when we say digital, for me, it's developing projects that we couldn't do before. So this is a guy from Australia who was at the university recently, close to us, and he wanted to ask this question about, can algorithms curate digital heritage with just speculative or artistic intentions? And he's called Mitchell Whitelaw, and he produced a machine which conceptually is something not close to what museums wouldn't develop this. Is the point. But he wanted to think about, can algorithms curate digital heritage in a way that would inspire new public engagement with collections? So if you go to his website, mitchell.net, and then Succession, he takes data from Internet Archive. He takes data from Internet Archive, and he takes data from Flickr Commons, which all relates to the industrial past of Newcastle upon Tyne. And, it's quite a simple, playful tool, but this tool compresses these photographs from these different time periods and represents them as kind of unique artifacts that he calls digital fossils. So they are layers of, these are layers relating to the industrial past of Newcastle, which are compressed together to create one unique artifact. Now, this is really nothing more than just producing something quite beautiful that is about inspiring and provoking questions. If you really wanted to see the layers that comprise this artifact, you can go down here and you can click through to the images on Flickr Commons. But it's algorithmically curated, and it is what it is. It's as simple as that, and it's quite a beautiful little tool. Anyway. So yes, it generates digital fossils from images documenting the history of Newcastle. So all of this that I've been speaking about, it's about enabling experimentation with collections, and it's about enabling broad inquiry and curiosity, and just seeing what happens. That's what it's about. Is we want to see sparks fly, and sometimes projects will be developed that have huge public impact. Sometimes projects will be developed that are abandoned halfway through. But the success for the project, for me, is about audiences understanding that they have the permission to do this, and they have the permission to come in or to find collections online and just to let their imagination fly. So it opens up the collection to questions the museum wouldn't ask, to projects the museums wouldn't deliver, and maybe to public impact not previously possible. And I will finish now, but this is the point that I've just made. The success is not just the quality of what's being produced, but is in audiences understanding that they have the permission to do this. The creative space and freedom that is so crucial to this work being produced. I don't know about you, but it doesn't really exist in the museum. We don't have that much creative space and freedom and time. We're all time pressured, but it exists outside the museum. So how do you connect with audiences that do have this commodity? The objects and collections records are, in some ways, the raw materials, and the impact comes from an articulation of the objects and their value. I am in the digital team, and I'm the digital programs manager, but the project's emphasis is on meaningful experimentation. It's not just about technology. The original, the format of what's being produced, it could be digital, it could be physical, it could be both. I think sometimes digital can feel like an artificial project parameter, and that the digital and physical experience are so meshed for so many of our audiences. Just having them separated can feel, artificial. And I do hope that the work that is being produced, at the core of all of this work is our collection, and that what is being created is responding to it, is revitalizing it, and giving new meaning to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.